Hello, this is Konrad, Yerba, Addict, here, and today I'm speaking with
Hello, it's Victor.
Victor, Victor Hansen, the cold email guru and marketing specialist and philosopher of life. And in today's podcast, we're gonna be covering mental models of Charlie Munger, but not necessarily only his. And Victor has a lot of good insights there. Actually, he's the person I learned about them from. He told me about the Farnham Street and mental models, and that they exist, and there's like a list of them, and he is the person I learned from, and I know he has a lot of good insights. So we thought we're gonna make just a long discussion about them today. Let's dive in. Victor, you want to start with some, one mental model that you selected, and maybe first. Oh, actually, maybe let's first. You can kind of maybe give your own like thoughts on how do you interpret mental models? Like, what are they to you?
Yeah,
And, like,
yeah,
what's your
yeah. I think
definition?
that's I think that's a good place to start because mental models. It really doesn't mean like the word mental models. I don't think it's a good word for it. I would rather call it like fundamental principles taken from different approaches or different disciplines. So, for instance, in physics, you always start from like Newton's law. You start from the most fundamental laws, and then you build on top to solve the most advanced pieces. Similarly, with mental models or fundamental principles, we start with taking just the principles from, for instance, like biology, physics, math, and then we can use those principles and then make decisions in a lot more complex areas, for instance, in business or in life. So it's also just the idea of thinking of an objective reality, so that we want to make our thinking align with that objective reality as closely as possible. It's every one of us have like in the way we're thinking, we have like our own world inside our brain.
Mm.
So every person has their own world and when they're thinking. So we want to try to make the inside world as closely aligned to the outside reality as possible, because then you can make better decisions. And the way I see mental models is just a way of learning these fundamental principles to help to align your thinking on the objective reality and the belief of objective truth.
That's definitely a good way. I heard of a name, for example, from somebody, because I was saying, I think on the other podcast I did with Matt, that since I learned about them from like the Charlie Munger, that I also heard about something similar from some other people. I remember one guy, I think, mentioned a name called like webs of meaning. That's how he referred to them.
Yeah.
So there's definitely like, I think maybe different names you could. So do you know any other? Because I think you also learned about them from Charlie Munger, but have you also discovered other people who kind of touched on very similar thing, but maybe in a different way or in different words, or they found also like some more loss, or is he like the
I
main?
I haven't found anyone else have that, because just Charlie Munger calls like the worldly wisdom, the wisdom across all disciplines for an entire life. I haven't heard anyone else come up with that idea. But the idea of finding the principles and always working from principles is like the most logical thing there is. So that's in math and physics and all like scientific disciplines, is that you try to always speak about truth. So I think that the just idea of finding principles is very applicable for anyone, and also a lot of other peoples have their own principles, and that's one thing I also think is important with mental models. So like the value of mental models is only the value that you're able to use them. So there's no need of just learning by heart all of those different mental models. Yeah, via negativa and 80-20 principles, if you're not actually able to apply it. So the value only comes when you're able to apply them. That's when you can start getting value and also mixing them. So We can go into that direction, just thinking about some mistakes most people make when they first try learning the mental models.
Mm.
And we can use another mental model from math to describe it. So it's like the difference between diverging and converging thinking. So diverging means, like, if you think about Spider-Man when he's shooting out the web, to start from one point and then it goes broad, that would be diverging thinking. So you start maybe with a problem, and then you go and then you discuss like many different solutions. That would be like a brain dump.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you have to converge to be able to make a decision. So you have to pick out what's the most important from all of them. So that's what most people are doing when they try to learn the mental models, is that they're trying to converge directly by just going to learn just the fundamental principles without converging first. So that's why, so the best way of learning mental models, in my opinion, would be to get the fundamental grasp of just reading maybe the classics of math and psychology, doing some, you don't need to solve like differential equations in like 7 dimensions, but you need to be able to understand like how mathematicians think to be able to apply those fundamental principles properly. So that's where you should first convert or diverge and then converge to be able to actually be able to apply the principles, because then you will have a lot more examples than just the names of the mental models.
That's interesting. But one thing, I think there's like a level under that, what you said, that that's like the mistakes that people are making. I guess the question there would be, what do you think is the reason that more people are, I mean, it's not talked about too often. I mean, as far as I did my research about that, there's actually, it's not a very popular kind of idea, and it's not explored too much. I mean, I saw a couple podcasts on that, like here and there. The Farnham Street, like he did that, but in general, it's not like a very known concept to a lot of people. So I guess the interesting question there would be like, what do you think's the reason for that?
Yeah. So I think like one of the reasons is that I think it's a lot harder than what it actually looks applying the mental models. So to actually be able to, and it also requires like a lot of discipline, like almost changing your brain, so that whenever you approach a new situation, you start with like just trying to find what are the properties involved in this system. How can I try to explain them using the fundamental principles I know? And it's also, I think the other hand is also knowing that it's very difficult to understand how to actually use them. Since Charlie Munger, he can explain the best, but until, if you, like, the only way to really understand the power, I would say it would just be to like hop into his brain and then just see how quickly he can do it, because it's not like you can get a recipe and just like checklist going through them. I think it's more just because I know Charlie Munger, he's reading, I think on average like 15 to 20 books a week,
Oh,
and he has
damn.
done that for decades. So it might be that that is where his knowledge has come from. And then he just uses mental models as a way of connecting all his knowledge in a usable form. So that might be a better. So it's almost, I think that everyone is using mental models in some way. It just requires such a large commitment of doing it for all of those different spaces. And it's also, it's not very applicable that there's no, like, you can't search for a job and then on the job requirements it said like know all the mental models, which is very hard to quantify.
True.
And then also very few jobs require you to have like a very accurate view of reality. It's like investing in some sorts, philosophy, but like if you just look like logic or objectively at most jobs, it's more figure out how to solve this problem as quickly and efficiently as possible. And then it's easier just to solve that one problem than spending perhaps like 1-2 years really learning all of those fundamental principles.
And would you say that because that's what I kind of explained, or like that's what I was my opinion on mental models, that it's basically like a way to distinguish like what's true and what's not without really having to, you know, like make like a deep research. So I think if you understand them, not even all of them, but like enough of them, then you can, yeah, for example, read a book and you can watch, you know, some guy on YouTube or read some article, and you can basically, without like knowing the specifics that he's talking about, you can kind of grasp and have a very good idea if what he's saying is plausible or not. Because like if he's going against like some of these laws, then, you know, like it's hard, I guess, to picture that, you know, some guy would be more right than a law that's we found to be true, right?
Yeah, I think also that, and I also think it's just the sentence I said earlier to for Charlie Munger to organize all his knowledge in a usable form. Because if you can imagine just he reading a book, he would just learn the fundamental principles deeper and deeper for each book he reads. So he's not like almost adding new knowledge. He's just like strengthening the knowledge he has previously. So that might be one of the way that mental models is like the most useful for them.
Mm.
It's just that you can learn things so much quicker. Because like let's say that we were to go golfing, like none of us had ever touched like a golf ball before, then we would have to learn all the techniques, everything just from scratch. But if we were to have done like a similar kind of technique before, I don't have any examples. But then we could say that all the golf swing is similar to like the boxing movement.
Mm.
So we would then be able to pick it up a lot quicker. So I think that's what he is doing also with the mental model. So when you have those really nailed in, then you can just pick up things a lot more faster because you can just integrate it into your web of knowledge instead of having to build that web of knowledge from the get-go.
All right, yeah. So it's very, actually, I think the one guy that has a similar thing, but he talks about it differently and similar to you is I think Ray Dalio, right? He has like the book Principles, and
Yeah.
he kind of talks about this concept of like, oh, this is another one of those. Like he says that,
Yeah,
okay, so
exactly.
like you categorize things and problems. So it's not maybe specifically this, but it's in that category. And then you know a lot better what to do with it, or like what opinion to have on that, or like what decision to make, because you already categorize it, even though you don't know like specifically this case, but you know it's like another one of those, right?
Yeah. That's exactly the point. And then also, it's just then you also be able to say it with greater convictions because then you can just try to classify it instead of interpreting it the entire situation from the start. So all the doing it very thoroughly.
Mm, okay. Okay, so I guess we have like the basis covered now. I think
Yeah.
like what's I guess maybe we haven't maybe sold people on it too much, but then maybe we just have to dive into some of them and maybe give some examples of why, you know, why knowing each of them individually would be useful for you, for the person listening, and when.
Yeah.
Because I think the cases with them, I think we talked about it, is that it's not like you can apply every of those, you know, principle, every one of those into every single situation,
Mm.
or you know, like aspect. You can sometimes it's, you know, like only one applies or a couple apply, but this one doesn't. So I think it's just the hardest part later is to, like, you know, just figuring out in your brain like which one could be, you know, the principle to use in this specific case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that too. And also just to circle back on why we haven't sold it so good, I think it's almost like a self-selecting, like almost like a product, the mental models. Because in my experience, when I've told something, they either get it and understand the value immediately, or they don't see the point, regardless of how much I try to talk about it.
Hmm.
So I think like for the almost like logical types of brain to be able to get the fundamental principles of reality, just that sentence was enough for me to just spend like hours and hours and hours researching it. But for others, that might sound like a useless idea, regardless of how much I try to convince them. I think that it's just something that it either clicks with you immediately, or you don't want to talk about it again, or not that bad, but you understand the point.
Hmm. And what do you think's the reason? Like, what's the difference between a person who's like immediately, interested in that, and those that aren't ever? Is there, you think, like some? Is it like some personality type, or like approach to the word, or is it gender, or is it an age, or?
I don't know. I don't know. It might be just like similar like why people like chess and why other people don't like chess.
Mm.
Might be just like a natural tendency. I don't have enough data points to be able to come up with like a valid hypothesis yet.
Okay. Only white people can.
Yeah, so far.
So which one should we start? Do you want to go first with some mental model you want to discuss?
Yeah, we can discuss, like, I've written down some of them, but we can start with Nassim Taleb's. He has a few mental models that is in Farnham Street also.
Mm.
So like the most fundamental, or the one we can start with, is just the Lindy effect. So Lindy effect. It simply means that what has been around for a long time is more likely to be along for equal amounts of time. So if we were to take books, for instance, the Iliad written by Homer like 2,500 years ago, it's more likely to be around 150 years in the future, so in 2150, than like a romance novel, like erotic novel that you can find in the airport that was published like last week. So it simply just, it means that when you look at just time, just by it have been around for a long time, it's like a self-selecting proof that it has a lot of value. Because if you can think about all the probability that a book survives for 2,500 years, is extremely small. So it's like probably like a lot of people have like given their lives to it, like fighting to the manuscripts to give them to Pope, and then he has run away. All of those cases over 2,500 years to survive it, it just brings value to it. So that means that if you want to make it, or we want to be as effective as possible, it would be more wise to spend time reading those classic books and what have been around for a long time, because then it's more likely that that will stay along for a longer time. So it's more like a long-term view on learning.
Yeah, so like it kind of connects to that famous quote. I forgot who is it, that there is nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, Kleistus or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think something from maybe Bible, or
Yeah.
And that, or maybe even before. I don't know if it's from the Bible, but anyway, that it's like a famous quote that I really started liking more and more, because yeah, as you said, it feels like most people think that the stuff that's from like a really long time ago, or even, I don't know, even if it's like from 20 years ago, they feel like, almost everyone feels like it has to be outdated, like
Yeah.
that for something to be applicable, it has to be new. And I started, the more I like read and dive into the word of like philosophy, and all those, like, and go into more like the classics and read those, and listen to like podcasts about talking about like different ideas and philosophies from the past, the more I kind of starting to see that it's actually most of the books and content right now is just like the old stuff repurposed for our like current
Yeah.
situation or mediums or whatever, but it's basically the same principle under that, like the same message. It's just kind of like rewarded, put in a different frame and given in a different different examples, but in the end it's kind of the same. Like it's just like people refrying the same old piece of meat.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so I have two ideas on that. Like the first one is just an example of what comes and goes around is that, GR tokens in the Lord of the Rings, the ring that makes you invisible.
The what? Can you say again?
The ring that makes you invisible
Yeah.
that Gollum has.
Yeah.
He has taken, I just read like Plato's Republic. And in that Republic, Plato tells the story of a man that went down into cave and found a ring that made him invisible, that he can take on and off. And he used that to construct an argument of what is justice if you can't get caught. So it just means that Richard just stole that entire idea from Plato. And also by reading the classics, it's very interesting. It's not about the story per se, but it's more that you can learn about human nature, because for someone to read a book and find it good, it has to be good for themselves. You don't care about if this is good for the community. A good book is something that you find funny or interesting or moving. So that means that for a book to have been along for, let's say, 500 years, it means that all of those people from the last 500 years, or just for it to have survived, must have thought that that book is good. It needs the book as all similar to way the reader finds something about himself in the book. The book needs to tell something about the reader. So when the book has survived for, let's say, 500 years or 1,000 years, it means that across all of those different societies and civilizations, the book has had told something to the people, and it has been the same. So the book has been something fundamental about the people as well. So what's interesting is that, sure, one of those books that have been around for 500-600 years might have been just the probability that some books survives and others don't. But when it becomes very powerful is that when you start seeing the same principles or the same stories and same values across those classics, so across those fundamental books, that's when you can draw out some of the real gems.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like you can actually see a lot of that in the for example, when you compare all those like religious books, they also kind of have very similar underlining theme, or like they call it like a narrative or whatever. Which actually, for example, I want to say that narrative is very closely, I think, related to that, because that's also true about those mental models, right? A lot of times that they kind of, some of them kind of like overlap each other, or they're like very connected. So I feel like with this one, and we are talking about books, that like narrative and like the whole idea of also like Joseph Campbell and that stuff, this is also like when you're saying that about Lord of the Rings, it feels like he stole it. For example, you said he stole it from Plato, so he stole it, but I think the big interesting thing there is that one way or another, the Plato guy and then the Lord of the Rings creator Tolkien, so they both stumbled upon, either by accident or on purpose, upon some like narrative that kind of really resonates with our brain and psychology in some level that we are not really even aware of, like that the story. And there are some stories like that like for one reason or another they just like connect with us so much. And I think this kind of relates to probably a lot of those books, that the principles in them, or like the ideas from them, somehow like relate to us so much that they survive so long. So I think it's very much connected to the narrative principle, or like mental model, right?
Yeah. So just like the narrative, it's called also like the narrative fallacy, that people always want to make a story about something. So the way you can have just facts is that you can tell any story about those facts. Nassim Taleb describes also that in one of his books, is that I think it was when Iraq was invaded by the United States. Like early on the day, it was like the oil price is falling because the US is invading Iraq. And then later on the day, the oil price actually increased. And then the same newspaper just wrote the oil price is increasing because the US is invading Iraq. It just means that you can tell any story from any facts.
Yeah.
So it's important to, just because someone says because what you said after because should be rooted in either a hypothesis or just like a logical description, not just not just like a story.
But at the same time, like what I noticed, and I think that relates to that, is that those books are like content that you can read somewhere and, just in whatever shape or form take into you. That is purely like facts. It doesn't register to your brain as powerful as if you read it or like listen to it or watch it as a story that contains those lessons. But if you just
Yeah,
do like a lot of people want to do now, like quick stuff, so like, oh, give me bullet points or give me the summary, feels like, yeah, you can take some takeaways, but it feels like it never really like truly changes you, because it somehow doesn't register on your like deep conscious level, like a subconscious level, as much as it's like a story told with those lessons kind of as some like steps on the journey or in the story.
yeah. We've been like discussing this here for quite a while. So how actually is how like the memory works. So it can't be true, but that's like I won't go into that discussion for now. But just what I want to tell is also that, let's see, could you tell that I lost the thought when I was going off to, it's just essentially just how memories are stored in the brain.
Okay.
It's like it can't be stored with just senses, because senses is how just your consciousness try to interact with the environment.
Mm.
It's a quite interesting to, and then I think that for the consciousness to decide which of those like almost data points, of which memories or which facts to store, it needs to have like a strong emotional intensity. So the stronger the emotional intensity, the greater the importance I think the consciousness puts on it. So that's why you need a narrative to get the principle, because then it's like your biological body is telling to your consciousness, if you view them as separate, that this is very important. We're firing like all chemicals.
Mm.
So remember this, because that's way, if you have had a very traumatic experience, like a car crash, you would never forget that. So that's like similar. So when you get the emotional intensity, it's probably stored greater than just true facts.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually just been uh, talking to somebody a few days ago, and I was talking about like why I think I don't remember, like, for example, like a city where somebody lives, because I'm like, it's not that I have a bad memory. I think it's because I have a selective memory, so I just pay attention to certain stuff, and some other stuff I just don't, because I don't think they are important.
Yeah.
And so I could probably remember it if I wanted, but I just don't think it adds any value, and it just like clutters my mind. So I just don't pay attention to something. And then I think there's like Jim Quick, he's really good on that, like remembering stuff. Like he has the new book, I think something about learning,
Yeah.
um that like, yeah, basically the and I heard in many places, like the way you learn, you have to like pay attention to something. That's like the one of the core ingredients, right? Like you have to
Hmm.
have the emotional response, and you also have to pay attention to that to have that. And then I think you have to do something with it to really strengthen that muscle even more.
Yeah. I think it's similar to the way Cal Newport describes it in Deep Work. That to be able to work, it's the amount of time you spend times intensity. So I mean, you can spend like 12 hours with intensity of 1,
Mm.
or you can spend 3 hours with intensity of 4. So it just depends how you want to structure it.
Yeah, and the guy I told you about who talked about the nervous system and stuff, he also basically was saying that Andrew Huberman, I think he was saying, yes, he was saying those things basically in different words, but it seems like it's very much the same. I think he was saying something about like focus plus, I think he was talking about focus plus urgency. I think that's how he described it. Like focus plus urgency that lets you, and those are like the ingredients that, even though supposedly we have the maximum like neuroplasticity until like age of 25, but still in adult life you can still overcome that through, you know, having like focus and urgency on something and really paying close attention to what you do, having like those deep intense moments of like focus, and then having those deep moments of like relaxation to recover and ingrain it.
Yeah. So like this is the way I've been like trying to build out this web of like fundamental principles. Is that, let's say you make this, so now you have one connection between Cal Newport and deep work, and also David Huberman. And then you can try to find, so now we have described things to just memory. So principles for memory and learning would be time plus intensity. And then we can try to, because when you read and when you come over, when you find these connections, you can just try to see, is it possible to deduce or try to distill down this same principles or this same principle to get it even more applicable to greater areas than other than just learning, and also like just learning and focus. So for instance, like one mental model that connects to this one is like vectors versus scalar, or just velocity that Farnham-Script calls it. It essentially just means we want to pay attention to the speed and also to the direction of the speed. So like speed of 50 kilometers an hour in the wrong direction is worse than 1 kilometers in the right direction. Or in just like with this time and intensity, just going in multiple different directions all at once, then the net total will be 0, since you would just like drag the same tau in different directions. So it's a similar process, but it's not like directly applicable. But this is the way I've tried to build up my own fundamental principles or mental models, is by making a lot of these connections. So maybe you come up with something like a few days from now that have the same equation, so time plus intensity. And then you can try to deduce it even further, and maybe and then you will create like your own fundamental principle that would be a lot stronger than if you were simply just to read the Farnham-Street article about velocity 20 times. But you would have a lot more data points to connect it and a lot more connections.
Okay. And how is that going for you, like this process? Because I can't really imagine like how to do it now, but is it?
Yeah, it's just like, it's very, I find it a lot of fun, but probably if someone else will find it quite tedious. But it just means that you try to, whenever you read something, you just try to make connections with other knowledge you have just stored in your brain or in just a Word document. Essentially just trying to make connections between for instance, if you're learning something about health, you might see that the same principles is applicable to business, like opportunity cost or some other principles. And then you try to just like deduce it further. So it's just to simply just try to make connections between your knowledge. So if you're reading a book, reading an article, try to see, are any of these arguments, have I heard them before in a different way? And then when you make those connections, you will just become better and better and recognizing the same connections. And then sometimes these connections will converge. You may highlight 20 connections to the same principles or principle. And then you can be able to put that as a fundamental principles. And then these things are constantly changing. But in that way, you're creating a web of knowledge. So all your knowledge is interconnected instead of being in silos in different like a part or parts of your brain.
Yeah, that's a very interesting. I've actually, now that you said it, I think I've been kind of doing that, but not like consciously maybe. But I think, yeah, I think that's a really important aspect. Like, for example, now that I'm reading something in a business book and it says, like, for example, what gets measured gets improved,
Yeah.
and he gives examples of, like, business world, but then I can immediately connect it very fast to, like, gym and workouts and like tracking your workouts and stuff like that. And I can clearly see, based on my experience and knowledge, that this applies the same way there. That
Yeah.
The people who truly like make progress there is the people that like track it, and then they see what's happening, then they are able to like progress thanks to that, or they can see what's maybe what's going wrong, and they can make some corrections, because they are tracking stuff. They're tracking their weight, they're tracking their lifts, they're tracking their workouts, the frequency, maybe how they feel, and then you can make decisions. So for example, that's like for me one like example of how you can start seeing those patterns across different like areas.
Yeah, because this is like the same like point I had made earlier, that you try to diverge in the beginning and then you want to converge. So in the beginning, it's like the same point with like Joseph Campbell, that you have a call to adventure and then you go into the dungeon and then you come back with like distilled knowledge. It's similar, that you can't go from order to order and then improve it. You have to go to order and then through chaos, and then through order again.
Mm.
So it's a similar process, that you have to first in the beginning, you have to like almost like shake up your order that you have in the beginning, and then everything is chaos. And then when you converge afterwards, then you will have learned something. It's similar to the point, I think I heard it from Sam Perrion, that every great life have had a great renunciation. So it's a similar point. So you go from order, you can't go from order to order. You have to go to order and then chaos and then order.
Yeah,
And
that's a good point.
Yeah, and it's also the same with like scaling business. You have like comfortable with one client, and then you add like 4 new clients, and then it's just a total chaos. But then you figure out the systems, and then you have order again. But then now you're serving 4 chaos, or it's 4 clients.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. That's definitely made my head blink.
Yeah, exactly. So this is like my thought process of figuring out those fundamental principles, or mental models, if you call them that. Because now you see, now I have like one mental model that's called like order, chaos, order, if you just were to call it that. And you can see just in the last like few minutes, I've already made like 5-6 connections with a quote, with a story, with a few other examples and facts. So in this way, I can be a lot more confident myself in that principle, since I have a lot more connections that's related to it, instead of if I just were to read it on Farnham Street.
Okay. And so, but how did you develop those connections? Is it just mostly through, just reading a lot of material that's like unrelated to this, but then just looking for patterns, like consciously looking for patterns, but not consciously searching for like for looking for them once you read something, but not necessarily reading everything or doing everything for the purpose of finding it. But then once you are doing it, you kind of just like, you can't help but find the patterns.
Yeah, it seems to be like that's the way it works. So whenever I'm reading something, it's just I make those connections almost automatically. So if I'm reading a quote, I might come up with some examples. If I'm reading a story, I could see how that connects with other things. And I think that is it's just a matter of consuming a lot of knowledge and just reading a lot of books. I think that's the only way of doing it, because then you will almost have like a bank of just a ton of stories, ton of examples. And then like your brain is like a pattern recognition machine.
Yeah.
So then it will naturally just do its job of trying to sort through all of those knowledge.
Mm.
But it's not like a conscious thing that, oh, I'm reading this book and I'm looking only for the narrative fallacy, and then I'm just searching for that. It's more that I'm just reading the book, and then I'm constantly asking myself, have I heard about this anywhere else? Is this connecting to any other of the knowledge I have? So it's more like a organic or natural process. It's not like a strict like German just working through like every sentence.
Yeah, but it's also interesting that like I think most of the principles and mental models and philosophies where I kind of learned now through theory, but you can find sometimes examples of people, like for example, I think like I remember a good example here would be like Jocko Willink. I think you know about him. It's
Yeah,
like a
yeah,
podcast. It's famous. Um, he, for example, said that even though he's never read or heard or learned about like Stoicism, that through just life and experiences and just going through difficult things and through many things and encountering life, he has he suddenly noticed that he has when someone told him about the Stoicism, that it very much overlaps to what he figured out himself.
yeah, yeah.
And it's a lot of times like this with this like David Goggins or people like that who just like they just took so much action that they also figured a lot of these things without really reading about them, which is also like interesting, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like similar to the quote we said earlier that there's nothing new under the sun. So if you, like, since we're all like humans, we probably have like the same underlying principles of how to live a good life, and it's also like very logical with like control yourself, self-discipline is a good thing, start your morning right. So it's also that, and it's also I think it's just we have gone from like considering those like stories and like the mythology, and then we've gone like very far over to the logos side. So everything has to make like logical sense, and we have to
Yeah.
read it, we have to have like scientific studies to back it up. And there's nothing, especially in the Western culture, we can't, like, you can't sit in a job interview and say, yeah, I'm searching for this job because the intuition told me to do it.
Yeah.
Like, you would probably just be laughed out of the room. But if you told like the logical step that I went to study here and there and there, and just a career trajectory, so everything we have to, like, especially in the Western culture, we have to have like logical, only make logical decisions almost. So it's also like an interesting aspect, because to make logical decisions, you almost have to have the theoretical knowledge available.
But it's also what's interesting there is that it's also kind of like in somewhat a fallacy of the current modern world, that it's not bad to be logical, but it's I think not good to just be logical, because
Yeah, exactly.
according to, for example, like Rory Sutherland, who is like maybe one of the best on this topic, um, it's like a lot of like great inventions and things like that were not created in a logical way. They were just like stumbled upon by accident through doing like some weird things, what he calls like alchemy.
Yeah.
And then we kind of reversed back, engineered that stuff, and we came up with like a logical way of how it's created and how like the whole story to it. But at first we just kind of came across it very accidentally or non-logically, like non-linearly, which I think is it's also a very important thing to remember, that yeah, even though you like learn about mental models, which I would say is like very logical approach to just dealing with decisions, problems in life, that's not like the only side of the street, right? Like with everything,
Yeah,
it's like yin and yang. Like you gotta have that, but you also can't forget that there's like the other stuff, like because there's so much we don't know, and there's actually more than we don't know, that you have to like have that space for being irrational, I guess.
yeah, exactly. So that's the interesting point, because the ancient Greek, they made like very distinct difference between what they called mythos and what they called logos, and they believe that that was just two different variations, but they were equally truth. So the logos, that's the logical, that 2 + 2 = 4, while mythos is just the the stories that were told over and over again, which had like a fundamental principle. Because if you want to find out like truth for me is just to give a definition of it. For something to be true, it has to align with like the objective reality. And for that to happen, we have to be able to make predictions. Because you can always say, yeah, it's God's plan after it had happened, but it's very difficult to forecast anything of what is God's will, because it can be anything.
Yeah.
So the way to have truth is that we can either have like the logical way, this is the logos, and then we try to be as specific as possible. So we want to have a small, like as least the least amount of variations as possible. So for instance, like with Newton's law, you have to be able, you're going in not like, you're not going in the speed of light, for instance, because then it just breaks off. Or for instance, when we're working with triangles in math, we have to like point them like in straight lines, and we have to have like there's exactly 90 degrees, and then we
Mm.
can use Pythagoras.
All right. Yeah.
That's like the logical side. So you try to be as specific as possible. So in these cases, this will happen. But the other part, like the mythos part, then you try to be as vague as possible and have like a fundamental principles that can be like almost like a second layer that can be applicable to as many situations as possible. So an
Hmm.
example of that mythos would be, for instance, like the golden rule. So do unto others as you want others to do to yourself. That can be applicable to like a huge all human relations can be applicable to that kind of rule.
Hmm.
But that's not like a logical rule. But you can break it off logically at the same time. So you can say that, yeah, I will do good in this business deal, because then he will be good to me afterwards.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
that's like the interesting points of being, that you can still, there's still the same truth, but one is very specific, while the other one is trying to be as vague as possible.
Hmm. Yeah. It's interesting that even like the so long ago, um, they kind of knew about this, and
Yeah,
uh, and I think that's something I wanted to say too, that it's like super interesting that even though all those things, like you said, for example, that these things that we are talking about, these are basic like principles to living a good life, but for some weird reason, that's why I'm so motivated now to like go deeper into like the podcast and exploring things like that, is that for some retarded or weird reason it got lost somewhere like along the way in the recent years. Like it's just
yeah,
like suddenly there's like so much bullshit, misinformation, and like stupidity, and just kind of creating new things even though the old ones are like there's more wisdom there, and like creating new like philosophies that are just plain stupid, and just going against logic a lot of times too. It's just like with a lot of things, like people are just going against like the more even logic, but more like our biology or our human nature, and they
Yeah.
kind of justify it that it makes sense, but it all doesn't. So I guess it would be interesting to hear your take on like what do you think has happened in the last, I don't know, like maybe 20 years or maybe more, that that
Yeah, it's not like I don't have an answer on it, of course, but I think it's interesting because it's same that like what Socrates was saying, like the Socratic ignorance, because what you had in like the ancient Greek is like the first time in like the Western civilization where people were they were realizing that we can use our brains and our logical mind to be able to use like theoretical insights, because before that we had only relied on like mythology and like stories that have been told, but then we started awakening just the logos. So then people were directly jumping into trying to figure out like the solar system, what was the shape of the earth, trying to figure out like if I were to poke the sky, with what would happen then, the limits of the universe. And then that was like the pre-Socratics, they were discussing this. And then Socrates, when he was like in his prime, he realized that before I tried to tackle those big challenges, like what's the Earth, how is the Earth moving through the sun or around the sun, he wanted like before I tackle that question, I first have to figure out how to live a good life,
mm,
how to actually be happy. So I think it's like almost like similar, but we're like we try. I think it's just a belief that everything can be solved logically. So then, if we're trying to solve it logically by being like solve happy as like a logical problem, then it becomes like just an accumulation of more stuff.
yeah,
So trying to buy cars, because of course a person with car should be happier because you have like some units of value or
yeah.
just unit of property, should be happier than without a car.
And then like with 3 cars should be happier than with 1 car
Yeah,
in
yeah,
that logic.
exactly. And then with 3 houses and 3 kids, of course you would be happier. And that is it's the same fallacy, or it's the same problem as like Nietzsche described, like the early 20th century, that God is dead. What he meant by that is like the mythos have died, so we're only relying upon the logos. So we're only relying on the logo, like we're only relying on the logical side of things. So we don't have that underlying faith that we're doing something very meaningful and for the entire like universe, or for God that we will come to heaven.
Hmm.
So what religion has been replaced with is like the state. So like the government is the new religion. So and then if the religion is state, it means that then we will just be obedient taxpayers, and that's like the end goal. So then we don't have like enough reason to justify the suffering that it takes to actually go through the pain to live a good life.
Mm.
So that means that we're just like on this hedonistic treadmill. We're constantly just trying to get more and more to fill the void
Mm.
without fixing like the deep underlying problem, which would be to relive the mythos, but just figuring out something to make the suffering worthwhile. I
Yeah,
think
like
that's my 2 cents on how to live a good life.
no, it's very good. I mean, like I think the biggest two problems like this this period of time is, I think, hopelessness and meaninglessness
Yeah,
of people. And I actually watched like some video today, some interesting channel that I found. I forgot what it's called, Life of Wonder or something with wonder. And there was like this video on the generation of doomers. There's like
yeah.
now a generation of doomers. It's basically like the people that like have everything and they consume, but they like cannot find any meaning to it all. And then like the opposite of them are the boomers that were in the past,
Mm.
that and that both of them like kind of realize the same thing, but it's what you take out of this realization and what you do with it is that. And I think that's, for me, that's basically the conclusion, that like once you like dig into all of it, you will finally understand the same thing, that no matter like which side you are kind of going from, or which generation, and you will figure out, okay, like life might be pointless, but then it's the question, like what are you gonna do with it, that really dictates like what's gonna happen to your life.
Yeah.
Are you gonna live a good life, or are you gonna live that meaningless and like kind of, how to say, depression life. And it's not, yeah, and it feels like it's not like what you believe the reality to be, but what you kind of do with that, like what's your approach because of that. Like, are you
Yeah.
just gonna, create your own meaning, or are you gonna just say, okay, nothing matters, so fuck life.
Yeah. Exactly. Because if you just were to look at it like very logical, like nothing of what you do has any meaning. Because we're like on just like a ball of stone flying through like infinity across like a burning star that will just swallow us, and then nothing of what you do will survive for like 1,000 years, or even though it would just be like reconsumed. So you really just have to figure out a story that you can believe in. And
Yeah.
then it's just like a sense of trying to figure out the best story to be able to get to your goals. So if your goal is to become president, then you have to tell a story that by you becoming, or you have to find a story for yourself that justify all the suffering from you to you becoming a president.
Mm.
Similar, if you want to be like an athlete, then you have to tell yourself, or you have to find the story that you believe in that will justify the suffering of you doing all the hard work to becoming an athlete.
Mm. No, yeah, that's no, I don't have much more to add there. Like, I
Yeah,
think
I think like to just have like the same discussion of what's going on. I think it's interesting to if you just take a look at it from like a psychology perspective, with like Jung and Freudian theory and like just your group psychology, is that it feels like the warrior energy in the population as a whole, if you look at it as a group, have been repressed for so long in the Western society or like the civilization, that it seems to be that it's finding like those weird different outlets to be able to express itself. For
mm.
instance, like in Norway, it's very common to be like very like obedient and then just like work like uh, very silently for like 5 days, and when the weekend come, you like drink beer until you like throw up.
Oh yeah, it's yeah,
That's
that's
like the
Scandinavian.
warrior energy has to be released somehow. And
Mm.
then like similar in like the US now with like the demonstrations, like racism. We don't have to discuss politics, but there you see the same like warrior energy that they want to fight for something. So it's
Yeah.
still like it's not like hopelessness in the population. It's more like despair. So people are like just wandering around and then trying to grasp on for something of meaning.
Mm.
And then just like the Black Lives Matter is giving them meaning to fight for something.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on that are mostly that, just I think, one, I feel like most people are super cynical right now, so like whenever you bring up anything closely related to what we are talking about today, then they just basically like shut their mind off, which
Yeah.
has been for me like the biggest, I don't know, like the biggest hurdle, or like something that's like on one hand inspires me, but on the other hand it like really sometimes feels like it's a lost battle of like how to, get people to like open up their minds to this, some of these ideas, maybe not all
Mm.
of them. And the goal wouldn't be even to like they have to change their life, but just so that like they can see that there's like this things that no one ever told them about, and this is true, and then they can decide what they can do with that. But for me, like the one big problem is that like most people right now, it's just like so cynical, and whenever
Yeah.
you talk about things, even remotely close to all of those things we talked about today, it's just like they just immediately like they just zone out. So I would say
Yeah,
this is like,
exactly.
for me, one big point. And another one, I would say, as you said, like people are looking for something to grasp on. I think the big one is that I don't know why, or if they are hidden or what happened, but it feels like just the world is lacking. The world is lacking real leaders. So like people
Mm.
who have like the courage, who can stand by their values, who can lead people, like who have like those fundamentally like really solid principles, and can somehow get people moving in the right direction. It feels like we had them over time. They just appeared, but somehow we are just, either they are somewhere like, I don't know, deep down in the underground, or they I mean, obviously they are in the underground now, because I know some of them, like Jordan Peterson, people like that.
Yeah, yeah.
um but it feels like they are somehow, yeah, like way down there, and I don't
Mm.
know what's the path for them, coming up and actually making a change. So for me, those are like the two big points I would say on that.
Yeah, yeah. And just to stay, if we call it like a mental models call,
Yeah.
we can just like try to describe how, or the reason why people are so cynical and not open-minded, by using like a few different like mental models to try to
Mm.
break down like the psychology, and also to try to understand it.
Yeah,
So
it's a good idea.
for yeah, so for instance, like Charlie Munger, he has what is called like first conclusion bias with like the sperm and the egg. So he describes it like similar to way like when the sperm enters the egg, that the egg shuts down. That's the way the human mind works with ideas. So when you like the first idea you come up with or you learned, that's the idea that you're most likely to stay with. And then on top of that, you just use confirmation
Confirmation
bias,
bias. Yeah.
which means since when we were like through evolution, there have been like very limited resources. So it means that the brain has to try to conserve energy. So then instead of trying to reinterpret it every single thing that happens, it's either just to say, oh, that's another one of those.
Mm.
Then it's like the selective, like almost like selective vision. So you only look for evidence that support your claim. And then with the internet, that's very, very easy because you just enter your own tribe or echo chamber where people have the same views.
Yeah, that's actually that's a big one. I mean, I have something connected to that, which is like that. Lately I realized, talking to a friend, that like you now have this like ability, like you said, to like connect to everyone on the planets. So you no longer have to. And we said that there is this thing, at least, I don't know, maybe you are seeing it also like in Norway and places like that, but in Poland, for example, I remember when I was like young, like like middle school or primary school, there was something like subcultures. So like you would be like a skate or a metal, or like I don't know, like a reggae person, or
Yeah,
or a hippie, or I don't know, something else, or like I don't know, it's like hooligan. And now it feels like those, they don't really exist. It feels like there's only like two groups now, like kind of hipsters and the rest. And because I think the reason for that, as you said, is that like people can connect, so they no longer have to get in those like you know in their vicinity, in those like tribes in their vicinity. They can just like connect from people around the world, but those connections are not really real. And they, as you said, and then it connects to the mental model, which is like they just kind of, the confirmation bias works harder, because it's like you all just like support the same story and no one really challenges it.
yeah, yeah. And also earlier it was interesting because then the only way to like portray your personality was just like in the physical world. So then you could like wear different clothing. That's like one way, or just using a skateboard. Then you're like a part of that group. But now with the internet, we have so much diversity that you don't have to wear different clothes. You can just create like an again different Twitter account, and then
Yeah.
that can be your like outlet of personality to feel that you have expressed your personality while no one else sees it.
mm,
That might be one reason why it seems to be a lot less diversity, since like everyone is wearing the same clothes, listening to the same music, etc. It just means that people are able to portray their personality in different ways on
mm,
online instead of in the physical world.
mm.
And also, just to get back to the point
Yep.
of with the mental models. We also have a few other mental models that's connecting to the group psychology, why it's so difficult to have an open debate. It's also with the social proof. So generally, ideas tend to converge for the mass majority of people to converge, and then what most people believe, they believe that it's true, similar to when we were living in tribe. So what like the 10 other people in the tribe believes, you would believe also, because other people are believing it and you don't believe other people are stupid. That's like the very general basis of it. In addition to this, we have also like the authority bias or effect. This means that we also have like authoritarian people or people of authority and people of respect. That's also influencing these groups and confirming their beliefs. For instance, like governmental and also like influencers on YouTube or Twitter or just like social media in general for each of their subgroups. And then like the last mental models that we can mention just briefly is also like incentives. So let's say that you're working like as a 9-to-5 job. You're not incentivized to take this big debate in like the lunchroom with your boss, because then you would potentially risk your bonus next month. This means that there's very, very few incentives, like at the societal level, to take this battle. Of course, you can argue that you have some moral reasons, and like for democracy to work, you have an incentive to work. But as a society in large, there are very few incentives to telling the truth if it's different from what the majority is telling. It's similar to like the messenger is often the ones getting killed. So that way, there's very few incentives to actually to say something that's opposing the majority, even though it might be truth.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
Yeah, so that's what like Charlie Munger calls like a lollapalooza effect. When all of these like mental models very strong is working together, it's just amplifying the effect even more to where you can create like such a large discrepancy where it seems that it's very logical that so many people can, like hundreds of thousands of people can one day stay inside terrified of corona and not going outside.
Yeah.
And then like a few days later, they can meet like, I'm not sure what the numbers were, but let's say like several thousand people meet in mass demonstrations for something that have never happened to them, or very rarely, with like the racism effects.
Yeah.
Even like white people were demonstrating.
But what's because I didn't see, like I didn't understand, and maybe some people were listening, the connection there. Like what's the connection between the first example, I forgot what it was, and the protests?
The process is just that people with the corona.
Oh yeah, okay. You said that on one hand people can stay at home in masses, and then on the other hand they can go. So I didn't understand like what conclusion were you trying to say?
It was just an example to show that it just doesn't make sense.
Okay.
That let's say 10,000 people are on Monday staying inside all day, being terrified of a virus, and then on Wednesday, 2 days later, they're meeting at the demonstration, like crammed together with 10,000 other people, when they were 2 days previously terrified of a virus.
Yeah, and the best part is that supposedly everyone's so logical now, but this is like the opposite of logical. Like if you look at all of it.
If you just look at it like purely objective, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, but I think it's the reason is like you said before, that for in some way like I don't know, the board right now, like the people are, I don't know, like squashed so much that like it seems like almost everyone is afraid to question something or question anything. Like it feels like it's like a very, yeah, it's like a very dangerous road to take, or I don't know if dangerous, but it feels like no one really wants to do it. And
Yeah,
as you said, there's not many incentives, because for me, like the best example I came up to my head was from my own life, from like school. Like for some reason I always had it in my life. I don't know what it is, but I always had it in me, and it stayed that I love to question. I mean, not love to question it, but like I had to question things, and I had it in me that like I have to say what I think, or I have to ask this question to really understand, or I have to say that, hey, it doesn't make sense, even though like no one else wants to do it, and that would almost always get me in trouble. So it
yeah,
feels like it for sure starts at school, where it's a lot better to, for example, just like fall in line than step out of it. But also the interesting, I guess, kind of thought there would be why some people, even though they are so, there's so much incentive and all those principles against working against them, they don't fall in line, like, which for example didn't happen to me. And I don't have like conclusion why it didn't happen. Like I know it's just they didn't stay with me, but I don't have like, for example, like a recipe now to give someone like, how take this is how you can, get to the same spot on your mindset as me. Like it's interesting, right?
yeah, yeah. It is, and it's also interesting to knowing that it's not sure that even we have like it sounds like that we know the truth. It's just that we have different perspectives. It
Okay.
should be at least be an area where we could discuss it openly.
Oh
So
yeah,
it doesn't
exactly.
feel like you have the because like it's very very difficult to be able to like let's say that we would just like abolish the school system completely, do it again. It might
Mm.
be better for people thinking like you and me, like very logical and like usually like take it almost like a medal to go against the grain. But for many other people, it might be that that's not like the most efficient way of doing it. But there should at least be some incentives, at least structured in the way that other opinions should be heard. And if they are better, they should be acted upon. That should be like the basic. That seems to be like the best way of doing it.
Oh
Of
yeah,
not
yeah,
trying
you
to
were right. Yeah,
suppress it.
you explained it better. That yeah, that's like, maybe I said it wrong, but I meant that, yeah, that maybe I don't know a lot of times better, or like when I even question something, it doesn't mean that what someone says is wrong, but just the willingness
Yeah,
to
exactly.
have
Yeah,
a discussion or talk about it, like why the thing you are telling me or teaching me or you're saying or telling me to do, or like why we do what we do, or like why is this true, or like just asking that question, which is, for example, something for sure that we have as kids. It just disappears somehow later. But as you said, like the good point there is that it's not about, for example, us being right, and all the things that happen are wrong. It's just like having a discussion about some, like revisiting, like why
yeah.
some things are the way they are. um
Mm.
and I guess I just wanted, before I, give you back to Mike, I had like one really good quote for that discussion that I took today from, it's actually from Nietzsche, and I think fits perfectly. It's like, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like it's kind of like describes everything we talked about, like this last part.
Yeah, yeah, I think that too. Because the fundamental belief in Nietzsche philosophy was that you can't rely on the masses to be right. It's only you have to like the individual itself has to rise above the masses, which is why he created like the Uberman or Superman is the English translation.
Mm,
It literally means to he like the way he saw it was that the masses they were slowly decaying until you have he called it the last man, and the last man is like the dopamine addict, so only doing things for his own pleasure, short-term pleasure. And then he almost like equated that to being animals. And then like the Superman was someone that overcame himself and he did like go to war with himself to overcome himself and become like an Uberman. And then he was, the way he's described it, he has some quotes in like Dust Spoke Zarathustra. It's also that like the higher you climb, the more the masses will try to drag you down. So, like the brighter the star shines, the darker the shadow will cast. Yeah, something like that. So you can also you see a lot of like Nietzsche's philosophy in like today's marketing. It's like called noble indulgences. I'm not sure if it's Nietzsche, but it's a similar point. The noble indulgences.
Mm-hmm.
So people are saying, yeah, it's okay to take like chips on Friday. It's okay to drink soda every day. It's like, okay, so that's like the dynamic among those lost men in Nietzsche's philosophy, that they're just trying to sustain their like the reality they have structured, so they don't have any suffering, but they're just the constant looking for pleasure and a constant like just with the eating, with food, with especially screens now, that they just want to stay in that forever.
Okay. I didn't know that he had those, like, even because I never actually got to read his book in the end. I have to do it. But is it from the Man's Search for Meaning, all those ideas?
No, Man's Search for Meaning is Viktor Frankl.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, Nietzsche.
So Nietzsche had written like Dust Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil.
Okay.
And but for anyone interested in looking at Nietzsche, you can just look up on YouTube. You have Academy of Ideas. That's also for general philosophy. It's a fantastic channel, which describes Nietzsche's philosophy extremely well. It's also like similar in life philosophy. It's like what Albert Camus said, is that you have to try to imagine Sisyphus happy. Are you familiar with the story of Sisyphus?
Yeah, I think I know, because
it's just
I know
like the
in
Greek.
Polish, I think the guy who would like do the same thing, like
It's a
rolling
Greek.
the stone, or what?
Yeah, he was like rolling a boulder up the hill,
Yeah,
and then it would just fall down again, and then you had to roll it up again. So to imagine him happy is what like the key to a happy life is, because you have to find meaning in the struggle, which we talked about earlier.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting metaphor.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like, we can go back to where do you want to say something more about like the mental models, connecting it to something we were talking about, or have you finished?
I don't have any good one connected with, or we can say, of course, like second order effects is connected with the last man. So like you always have, when you make decisions, you have the first order consequence or the effect, and then you have second, third, fourth, and like the nth consequence. So like the first consequence of eating a burger would of course mean that, yeah, it tastes good. And then just like the second order consequence would be like maybe like 2 hours later, you're quite lethargic, you don't have as much energy. And then the third order consequence might be that you don't you didn't work out, and then you feel guilty about that. And then like the nth order consequence is that you're slowly turning your and then like the almost like the nth consequence is that you're becoming the person that avoid doing the difficult thing, and you only do the easy thing. So that's like the nth order consequence, and that you can almost see. Like, I know Sam Owens has a fantastic video where it's still like the time horizon of the consequence. Then you show the graph. So if it's positive in the beginning, so it's immediately good, then it's most likely the long-term effect will be bad. For instance, like with eating candy, with skipping a workout. But if it's bad immediately, it will slowly rise. It will slowly rise and become better. In like a certain sense. For instance, like a workout, it might suck for half an hour or an hour. after that, you will get more energy, and you will slowly becoming a more healthy person.
Mm.
So that's maybe just one mental model to press into it. But as you can notice, you can almost take any mental model and try to fit it inside. For instance, we could talk about 80-20 principle
Mm-hmm.
and also apply it to philosophy. Or we could talk about limited resources, and it's necessary it's like logical for like a human brain to want to continue like looking for sugar and looking for those dopamine hits. Or we could talk about like social proof that everyone else is doing it. So I can see like since these like principles are so vague, we can attach them to any example.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's like that's the disadvantage of mental models, is that they can become too vague,
Yeah.
so they lose their benefits. It's the same as like if everything is a crisis, then nothing is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's similar with the mental model. So you can apply them to everything, and then they lose their value. So that's what I've been like struggling with, is figuring out what is the best way of actually using them in a decision instead of just adding complexity. Because you can
Mm.
add all those mental models to any situations, but it doesn't mean that it helps you describe the situation more clearly, even
Mm.
though the text or article would be longer.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point.
But I
Um,
don't have a solution to it, so not sure what's the best way of doing that is.
and then is, for example, on all of that what we said, we could also apply like one of my favorite like mental models, like Occam's razor. So like, to read the definitions, like simpler explanations are more likely to be true than complicated ones. This is the essence of Occam razors, a classic principle of logic and problem solving. Instead of wasting your time trying to disprove a complex scenarios, you can make decisions more confidently by basing them on the explanation that has the fewest moving parts.
Yeah, and that's the similar as what we discussed earlier with like the different variations of truth. That we have the logical, which is like as specific as possible, or we have the like fundamental belief that is as vague as possible.
Mm.
It's a similar process. So as with Occam razor, like the less details you have, but the more different variations it will be true, or the more situations will fit it.
Yeah, 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 exactly. And it's and then I think it's a lot of it is also that I don't know if it's 80-20, but there is like this discussion I had today with some friends where we said like, if I about like a doomers and boomers. I said that um I'm a boomer, and then my friends say like, hey, you can't be a boomer because you are born in like you're a millennial, right? Because I was
Yeah,
born like 1995. um and I said, well, but can't I just be like born in that, but just have the approach to life of a boomer? And then we had like a back and forth. And I think one of my friend like used the example of like, so there can be a woman that can like fight a man and defeat him, but in general, men are stronger than women. So it's kind of like, I don't know what my point was, but my point was, I think that it's not, I guess not, it's not always like, I guess it's not always true, but just because it's not like always true doesn't mean it's not a good like principle. I guess maybe
yeah,
that's what I was trying to say.
yeah, perhaps. And it's also just with any theory or any like formula, there will always be a limit. That's like the circle of competence that Charlie Munger, to understand like the edge of the knowledge, understand in which specific situations it can be used, and in which situation it will break. For instance, like you can take like for instance like the law of attraction as like one of, you can say that it works generally for a lot of people. But then you can always take like the what about the child that got cancer at like 4 years old? Like did like the mother wanted it, or did the mother want the child to have cancer? Of course not.
Mm,
So that's the similar to where like the limits of it, or like Newton's law, that it works until it becomes very, very cold, or particles move at the speed of light, then it breaks off. So it's also just equally important as to learn something is to learn when you can't use it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I guess that was kind of my idea there, that like that it's good to know this, but it's also understand like the limitations of some of those principles or whatever, that they are not like end all be all.
Yeah,
um
yeah, exactly. And then we can also take another to the similar, that you would like to call yourself like a boomer, and then your friend is discussing, no, you can't call yourself a boomer because you're not that identity. And that has the similar thing about like human psychology, is that we always want to attach our identity to something. So we want to say, yeah, I'm a Norwegian, so I'm doing this and this and this, or yeah, I'm a football player, or I'm an athlete. So we always want to attach our identity and find our tribe. It's also just like a similar situation, that you would want your identity to be like a boomer instead of a millennial, but you think that yourself, like that you believe more in the story of the boomer for yourself than the millennial.
yeah
So it's also interesting to see that really, like, boomer and millennial, it's just some words that we humans have made up. They don't exist in nature if we were to exist without words. So it's also interesting to look at just the stories you're telling yourself. Just remove the ones that is not useful, and then just like add the stories and add the stories that you believe in, and that's true.
yeah 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 um I saw that you wrote to me, so I guess we can no, I was actually thinking that we can maybe slowly just wrap this up, because
Yeah.
my brain's a bit starting to slow down
Yeah.
after almost two, and we are getting close to like 2 hours.
Mm.
So I thought maybe if we can just say like our uh, last thoughts, and maybe finish for this this part, and then maybe we can like next week we can continue with some more mental models or something like that, or like
Yeah.
in a week
Yeah.
or two. And for this one we can finish off. So um what what would you like to end on? Do you have some like a big I don't know, takeaway you would want somebody to have? It's like how somebody can, maybe, I guess maybe the good question would be like, how can a person who's kind of new to this not get overwhelmed with this whole concept ideas? And because it kind of seems complex until you see it isn't. So
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe
I
your
would
thoughts on
try
that.
to say that, because for any people that approach it's like a very big task to try to learn all the 100, and like try to learn like physics and math and psychology at the same time. So what I would recommend, and I think would be the smartest way, would be to try to deduce fundamental principles in your area of expertise. So for instance, if you're listening and then you're like a 30-year-old like salesman, try to find the fundamental principles of sales. And then once you have them, see if any of those principles can be attached to any of the other parts of your life
Mm,
that there then would be fundamental. For instance, like I know, for instance, from my sales experience, have worked a lot with improving my other relationship with other people, being just more direct and making sure the expectations are clear. So to try to deduce your own fundamental principles based on your area of expertise, and then see how those connect to all the other ones.
mm,
And then what happened to me when I did that by seeing what kind of principles I learned from doing sports. And then I saw that once I have deduced and I had a list, I can see that the list I have made from sports, some of them connected to some of the mental models that Shane Paris had written about in Finance Street. So I think that might be the best approach. That's like the easiest. And then the very long-term approach is just reading and consuming a lot of information, and then just almost like telling your brain to optimize for finding those patterns, and then try to make as many connections as possible whenever you're reading or learning or listening to something.
Okay. So on one hand, it's kind of like taking action in a sense. So just like looking for them. And on the other hand, like actively like looking for them in your area expertise, let's say. And then the second side would be theory, which is like just, learn more about different topics of areas and lives and areas of life and word, and then try to just get more data points to kind of connect those ideas and stories, right?
Yeah. I think that would what I would recommend as of my experience up to now.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's a perfect way to finish this off. I mean, I think there's plenty to take away. Probably needs a couple listens to really digest all of it for somebody. But I think there's a lot of like actionable steps here. So I think was good talk for the for the first time doing it for us. And so yeah, let's officially end this. So thanks for anyone who's listening to it or is gonna listen to it. It was Konrad speaking and Victor. Thanks a lot. I don't know, Victor, you want to say some last sentence?
Yeah, I don't have any good words to say. Hopefully it was valuable if anyone listens. If anyone I will probably, when this podcast is up, I will have written some articles on my own site. So if you just go to my first and last name, so victorhansen.com, you can probably find some articles there if you want to dive deeper, and also just contact me by email or Konrad. And then we will probably make more of those videos, so stay out and look for them.
Okay, perfect. So thanks and see ya.
Goodbye.